Good evening. Thank you for joining us for our partner event. Tonight is the last of 3 panel discussions on building inclusive communities. We'd like to begin with an introduction of the organizations collaborating to bring you this event tonight.
Hi, my name is Cindy Parsons. I'm the director of the St. Croix Family Resource Center. And we have been putting on building community events for many years. And so we felt like this was the time to readdress inclusion, diversity, and equity. And we're joined by both Youth Service Bureau and Southwash Co-Cares to put on this series of 3 conversations. Tonight we're wrapping up, and it's been just delightful. A warm welcome to everyone here, panelists and all attendees. The St. Croix Family Resource Center serves low-income families as well as youth with unstable housing. We work with youth through 2 drop-in centers that we have, one in Stillwater and one in Cottage Grove. We have an after-school program for families. And we also have a supportive housing program that helps people so that they can find housing and then maintain that housing. So we really love to help all of our youth and families have healthy community. And so one of the ways that we do that is by addressing the community and addressing issues that need more awareness. So just thank you all for coming tonight.
And good evening, everyone. My name is Mary Gugesberg. I am the Youth and Family Education Coordinator at Youth Service Bureau. What a treat, what a joy to partner with both South Washco Cares and St. Croix Family Resource Center. It's been just a privilege to learn from these wonderful organizations and the messaging that we have gleaned from our 3, and thank you everybody who's joined us for all 3 of our panel discussions. I have grown, and I hope each and every one of you have as well. A little bit about Youth Service Bureau. We are frequently known in the community as YSB. If you've ever heard it, schools or partners say that, YSB. We started with our diversion services, which really helps hold youth accountable, gives them the opportunity to learn from the situation that brought them to our agency, hold them accountable, and give them that second chance. So that's our diversion. Our mental health therapist, we see kids from 5 to 25 years old, and they are in office. So we have 3 locations, Stillwater, Woodbury, and Cottage Grove. Right now, though, a lot of teletherapy is happening during this season. We also have chemical health specialists. They focus on early intervention, prevention. We serve families in 3 students in 3 school districts. We're in District 622, Oakdale, Maplewood, North St. Paul, Woodbury, Cottage Grove, 833, and District 834 is Stillwater District. Middle school and high school is really where we focus that early intervention, prevention. And my area, youth and family education, which is why I'm part of that partnership tonight. It's just a joy to be able to share, educate, help parents build their toolbox around all of those challenges. I didn't get a manual when I brought my own children home, so it sure is nice to be able to just collaborate and give tools and resources for others. And again, I thank you all. It's been a joy to meet people and just learn together in this series. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Cindy and Mary. I'm Cheryl Jogger. I'm your host for tonight. I'm the founder of Sawashco Cares. Sawashco Cares stands for South Washington County Community Action Reaching Every Student. And our overall mission is really to set our students up for success in every way that we can. This could be anything from making sure they have food, clothing, to basically any sort of basic need that our students and families have. But really what we're trying to do overall is to engage the community to help meet the needs, but also to really build connections among the people living in our community and really help take care of each other. Especially during these difficult times, it helps to know that we're part of a community that cares. And that's really what Sawashco Cares is all about. It's our community helping our community. So tonight's topic is self-care and care for the relationship during conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's December, and so what better time than this season to talk about self-care. This year being even more stressful than usual, we really need to take the time to take care of ourselves as well as others. And so for those of you watching at home, we want to encourage you to participate in this discussion as well. In the chat, if you would please share where you're from, we would love that. And then if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature to send our panel members a question. And just a quick reminder that this event is being recorded and will be available on each of our partner organizations' websites, and we welcome you to share it with others. And so now a special thank you and welcome to our 3 panel members for tonight. We have Sandra Saucedo-Falagan, Olivia Alston, and Brandon Jones. We're so excited to have you here with us tonight, and we want this to be a true conversation among the 3 of you. So I will direct questions to each speaker, but please feel free to jump in where you would like. And then we'll also be weaving viewer questions in where we can. So let's get started. Panelists, when I call on you, please take about 2 minutes to introduce yourself. And if you could share with us how you define self-care and give us some examples of self-care. Sandy, would you like to start?
Sure. My name is Sandy, and you needed a brief introduction, correct? So Sandra Saucedo-Falagan, and I am currently the A&I coordinator for South Washington County Schools, A&I Achievement and Integration. And our department really is the equity department of the district. And we really strive to making sure that our students, all of our students, but specifically our students of color and different abilities, are being treated and getting all of the opportunities and services that they need. We look through policy, we look through practices, we work with our teaching, we work with different departments to make sure that everything is equitable, and we try to make it as equitable as possible. Equity is really part of my life. I do it outside of work. I write curriculum, I do PD outside. So for me, that is kind of self-care. So for me, it's about, and to me also self-care is very cultural, right? So different cultures and different traditions and groups of people define self-care very differently. So self-care to me is about family, and also it's about me growing as a person. I was very marginalized growing up as a Latina in an urban setting in Chicago. So for me, school was my outlet. School was the place where I got to learn and I got to grow, and I got to get out of the neighborhood, right? But at the same time, I'm still drawn to that neighborhood because I want my other students and my family and my culture to grow as well. So for me, self-care, it's really about learning and continuing to be that lifelong learner. So I do lots of reading, lots of professional development, and all of that great stuff.
Thanks, Sandy. Olivia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so hi everyone, my name is Olivia Alston. I also work in South Washington County Schools, and I am a community culture liaison in the district. And I work mostly at Woodbury High School, Cottage Grove Middle School, and I run some groups at East Ridge High School as well. And I work with Sandy all the time, and she's great. So yeah, I think for me, my journey to, I guess, this job started when I was in college, and it was less to do with my actual degree, which is in political science and sociology, which helped. But it was really my experiences at a PWI as a student of color, as a Black woman. I went to UW-Madison, and I was part of a scholarship group that was for marginalized students, and so I had that group. But outside of that, it felt very isolating. And actually coming from Woodbury, I went to Woodbury High School. I thought I was ready for that because I was kind of used to it, and it was a whole different ballgame when I got there. And so those experiences and some of the, issues we had on campus and getting involved to make sure that that wasn't happening anymore led me to this work here. And it's just great to be back in my district to try and make it even better for the students coming up. And so, yeah, I think for me as well, that's kind of self-care. I feel in a way obligated to do something. I don't think I could sit back and kind of just watch as things happen. I feel the need to help in any way that I can. And that makes me feel like I have a purpose and I'm doing something. Um, so self-care for me is definitely sometimes like eating your favorite meal after a bad day, but it's also recognizing what you need to do to make sure you feel fulfilled in life and are making a difference. And sometimes it's hard too. It's, doing the thing you don't want to do because you know it's best for you. Um, so I think that's how I define self-care. It's the superficial stuff that's fun to do, and then it's also that deeper stuff that helps you grow as a person.
Thanks, Olivia. Brandon, how about you?
Yeah, that was great. I'm Brandon Jones. I'm a psychotherapist, professor of graduate studies at Metro State and undergrad, and I bounce between Century, Embry Hills, and Dakota County Technical College. And then also I do consulting. I do more consulting than anything these days, which is helping develop curriculum, programs, and working on projects through various different organizations, schools, and just in governmental entities throughout the state, really. But most of my work focuses in the Twin Cities metro area. For myself, the way that I would define self-care is being able to take care of yourself when times get hard. And one thing that I like to share, and I'll talk probably more about this as we go through today's panel, is for me, self-care is more about being proactive than being reactive. And many of us have learned self-care in a reactive manner, that something bad happens, then we have to, drink a special tea, go take a break, binge on our favorite ice cream or things of that nature. But to me, I think self-care is really about preparing for the tough stuff. And I think COVID-19 has been one of the best examples of how uncertainty happens, tough stuff happens. So we should be prepared so that the blow doesn't happen as bad as it normally would. So for me, self-care is more about proactiveness, and I call that being sustainable than just the reaction. But we do react to things. Stuff happens, and it can be really uncomfortable. But yeah, that's kind of my take, and that's who I am, and I look forward to today's conversation.
Thank you. Let's jump in. Sandy, why is it important to have people in your life with different opinions than yours? And where would you suggest connecting with people who can help us learn more about different opinions?
I think it's really important to have people who have different opinion, is because we don't live in a vacuum, right? And I don't live in my house by myself all the time. Even in my house, I have people who have different opinions on different things. And part of what I was saying before is about continuing to learn, is that we also learn from other people and other people's experiences. And for me, having conversations with people to understand where people are coming from is really important. Although we might not necessarily always agree, but I think it's important to understand where people are coming from, their opinions, why they feel that way, and then have that dialogue. It also allows me to self-reflect on my own thought process, right? I don't know it all. And I don't ever expect to know it all, right? So I think it's important to continually have different opinions and different thoughts so that I can better grow, or also confirm my own thoughts, right? So someone might say something and they might completely disagree with me, but that might also confirm what I'm thinking or what I'm feeling, or vice versa. They might say something and might resonate with me and be like, oh, wow, I never thought about it that way. So I always talk about frame of reference. Everybody has a frame of reference, and part of your life experiences fills that, and then you have bias because of it, right? But the more that you add to your frame of reference, the better you can really start to attack that bias that you have, and then implicit bias, and start reflecting on those pieces. So having those people around who have different opinions can help fill your frame of reference, and also help you understand where their frame of reference is as well.
Would anyone else like to answer? Why is it important to have people in your life with different opinions?
I'll dive in there. I think that, I love that frame of reference. The term that I use is this, it's the same concept, is worldview. Like we all have a worldview that we develop throughout time. People that influence us, the spaces and environments that we're in, the schools that we go to, they all help to shape and mold our worldview, our families. And by having, people in your life with a lot of different perspectives helps you grow. And it does, absolutely, just like Sandy said, it reduces those bias, or at least shifts them, because when you don't know something, you just don't know. And as human beings, we stay close to the things that we understand and make us feel comfortable, and that limits our experiences when we don't have, a variety of different perspectives. And that's why I think it's important to always fill your, just our day-to-day, our entertainment, our news cycles, where we get our information, with things that may be differing from our views and our perspectives, because you might actually learn something about yourself, or just an alternative way of thinking. So I think that it's important to widen that frame of reference as best as possible.
I think it's natural for humans to just find like-minded people and stay with that because it's comfortable and it's, what we know. And we see that even in social media, where you tend to kind of live in your own bubble on the internet, even though it's supposed to be this thing that can widen and expand our viewpoint. And so, and that's happening more and more. Feeds are made for you, like a For You page on TikTok. You get into that one place and you're like, these are all things I agree with. Twitter is the same way. You follow certain people. And so it's natural. And so to break that down takes effort, and it has to be a conscious thing that you do. And it just, like you said, it's the only way to really just learn all of the time throughout your life, is just to be surrounded by people that have different opinions and be willing to have maybe not, not confrontational, but more, I guess, yeah, more confrontational conversations, right? It's not just two people in a vacuum talking constantly. It's like, well, I don't know where you're coming from and why do you think that way? And even if you don't agree with that person, understanding where they come from and why that life experience led them to think that helps you have conversations with other people in the future. Like, okay, I remember when I had this conversation with this person and this was the life that they lived to get to that point. I now know how to talk to somebody who may have a similar situation and maybe help change their mind or break it down if it's something that is harmful. So, really agree.
Olivia, how do you emotionally prepare for a conversation that may be more challenging and could cause emotional stress? And do you have responses that you have prepared ahead of time going into it?
I would say I try to take a second to think about why we're having the conversation, and what's the goal of the conversation. And that helps keep me focused on what we need to accomplish and what I want people to understand or take away from it. And as long as you kind of have that in the back of your head, I think you do better at handling it emotionally, because you feel like you have a little bit more control over it. And I wouldn't say I come up with things to say exactly, but I do maybe jot down some bullet points of these are things I absolutely need this other person or this group of people to understand and take away from this. Whether they agree with it or not, or they want to follow up because they really don't like it, that's fine. But I need this group of people, this person to understand these points for this to be a successful conversation, and to make sure that I feel heard, and that I'm advocating for the person I'm having the conversation on behalf of, which I do a lot in my job. Um, and so making sure that you feel clear about your goal on your end is all you can do, because you don't know exactly how that other group is going to respond. I presented to the entire staff of a high school and it was heavier stuff. And all I could do was think about, okay, well, if this is the response, then this is how I'm going to handle it, right? I'm either going to address it in the moment, or I'm going to decide to just keep moving and then follow up later, which is what I decided to do. So that's all you can do, is just kind of prepare for either way it goes, and know and feel confident on your end what you want to get across and stick to that. And that, sometimes feelings do get hurt, but it's all in progress, right? We're trying to make progress and it's not a comfortable thing. And so expect the discomfort.
If I can add, is to also go into it thinking that you have to be okay with non-closure. that the conversation doesn't have to end somewhere, and it doesn't have to end with both of you agreeing on the same point or all of you agreeing or most of people, because organic learning and organic conversation usually doesn't have closure, right? So we have to be okay with that. And we also have to be okay knowing that things are going to get uncomfortable, right? So when we talk about courageous conversation, those are those two norms. So there's two pillars. Um, there's four of them, but two of those is one, and that last one is being that you have to be okay that there's going to be non-closure in some conversations, and probably most conversations, and that courageous conversations are uncomfortable. But when I think about that, to me, we want conversations to be moving. It's like a river. We don't want conversations to be stagnant, because stagnant water feeds into disease, right? So we want that water to be moving and to be uncomfortable, and to flow. So it's okay. Sometimes we're going to hit some rapids and it's going to be really uncomfortable, but that's okay. To understand that that's how we make movement. And sometimes some of us move a little faster than others, and we have to be okay with that.
Absolutely. And just to build on the metaphor, I would even say to shift our mentality and not look at the conversation as the river or the stagnant water, but ourselves as that river. And we're on this consistent flow of developing ourselves and continue to move down this journey of learning things differently. Yes, these conversations are courageous, and yes, these conversations are uncomfortable. They're supposed to be, because if they were easy, we would solve these problems and we wouldn't have them. And it's okay to be in that space of being uncomfortable. There's no growth in the comfort zone, and there's no comfort in the growth zone. And when you are uncomfortable, that means that you're actually paying attention and you're actually challenging your thought process and your beliefs to see, is this the best way to do things? And I see so many people too that get into these conversations that try to convince other people to think like them. And I think that that's a really difficult task, and probably not the goal of the conversation. It might not be to convince them to have the same thought process as you. It's just to share ideas, to figure out, is there any common ground, and is there a better way to coexist with people that may not share the same background as you?
Brandon, can you define the term triggers for us? And how do you know what triggers you? And how can you talk with others about these triggers?
Yeah, that's a great lead-in question. I mean, pretty much triggers are those things that make you feel uncomfortable, those things that bring a little anxiety into your life, those things that, make you get a little nervous or make you go, should I have said that? Like, should I do that? Those are those triggers. Or maybe, did that person really just say that? That could be a trigger as well. And really what happens when you get triggered is when someone crosses a boundary of yours, whether that's an ideal, a norm, a custom, a value, something that you have, that you hold, and they cross it, and they do something that's counter to it, or that might not be the exact same way that you'll do it, and that may make you feel some type of way, and that's okay. It's okay to have those feelings. And again, as we all kind of shared our own perspectives on being okay with being uncomfortable, but you have to be kind of in tune to know what your triggers are. A lot of times people don't know what their triggers are until that line is crossed, which is also important. And that's good self-awareness. So when you have that level of anxiety or that level, even fear or frustration, that's a good opportunity for you to kind of look at yourself and say, what was it about that conversation or about that individual or those people that I engaged with that made me uncomfortable? Is that work that I need to do? Is that work that, how do I work on that particular issue as well? So, triggers come in many different shape, forms, and fashions. They could be seeing a hat or a t-shirt or a flag or something that went across a commercial, or, something that your in-laws said over the holidays, while you had your Zoom Thanksgiving. It could be the term Thanksgiving. It could be a lot of different things that can trigger us. And when you feel those triggers, that's kind of a cue for yourself to say, I need to do some work there.
I always start when I am having, especially in big groups, when I'm sharing information that's kind of outside of people's typical circle or bubble of information, I always tell them to be aware of things that maybe that trigger them, right? So if I say something or I share a news article or whatever, and you feel, defensive about it or attacked or whatever it is, take a step back and kind of like, okay, why do I feel like that right now? Where is this coming from? And like you said, it's that self-reflection. And sometimes when you're having these conversations, that's all you can do in one go, is just get people to self-reflect, which is super hard to do. And so even if you don't convince them or change their mind about anything, you made them look at their experiences in their life in a different way and learn about someone else's and go, oh wait, okay, so this is different, or a lot of things I've known my whole life might not actually be what they are. And that's a lot to process for people. So there's patience, but it's also um, understanding that those triggers are real, even if to you they seem like they shouldn't be, like this information shouldn't be triggering, you should know this. But for some people it is. And so you have to give people some time and let them process those things. But yeah, I always say be aware and look at your trigger and go, okay, why am I feeling like this? Where is this coming from? And that's super important.
Sandy, how do you respond when somebody you care about says something that you strongly disagree with? And what if it's somebody that you work with?
Oh, this has happened to me in my personal life and at work as well. I think what I start to do is I listen, and I try to then ask questions, clarifying questions, like, what do you mean by that? Or can you give me an example? So that, again, going back to that frame of reference or that worldview, thinking about, okay, where is this person coming from? And then also making sure that I'm clarifying and asking for that clarification, because I might have misunderstood what they were saying, or I might have been triggered by something, so I try to stop and I try to ask those clarifying questions. And those questions do a couple of things, right? So not only does it help me, but it also brings it aware so that that person is restating in their brain what they just said or what they just did. Usually when you have to restate it, you're like, oh, maybe that didn't come out right, or maybe that's not what I said. That's what I meant. And then if it is what they meant, then again, it's to have the kind of the courage to kind of, and then you would have to decide, right, who that person is, kind of deciding who that person is, what that relationship is this necessarily a conversation that you need to have with them? And I would always say, I always want that conversation, but there's times, and there's a time and a place for certain conversations. Like, is it in the middle of a classroom? Is it in the middle of a hallway? Is it in the middle of a staff meeting? So kind of thinking those pieces, and then maybe if that statement or whatever continues to bother me, if it's such a strong statement, then I might go to that person privately and say, hey, I really wanted to talk to you about our discussion earlier, and I really kind of want to dig deeper about that conversation and just kind of understand where you're coming from. And this is how I feel. So I want you to know how I feel, and then try to work that out. Again, it's really hard to work to try to change anybody's mind, right? And that's something that you have to, as much as we would like to change people's minds, it's really hard to do that. But what you can do is you can have a conversation, and let them know where you stand, and also not be afraid to speak your truth. And speaking your truth doesn't mean that you're going to say it, blatantly in someone's face and be aggressive about it. You can calmly say, this is my truth and this is how I feel about it. And this is, your statement hurt me and this is why it hurt me. It's okay to tell people that their words hurt, and tell them why it hurt. I've had those conversations. I've had those conversations at work. And So I think it's just making sure that you are feeling honest about that. And then if you need help to have that conversation with that person, also to try to seek it, find your allies, and maybe talk to somebody to say, hey, this person said this, and this is how I felt about it. How, and try to be confidential, of course, but how should I approach it if you really need that extra help, if it's that severe that you need to have it. But I think it's usually a personal issue that you need to confront it. If you feel like you need to confront that person with that conversation, I think you should. But again, it always depends on how you're going to do it.
This one is for any of you. Do you feel expected as a person of color to educate others? And what has your experience been? And what can we do to support diverse populations?
It's an interesting question. I would say it depends on the setting and the time. Sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't. I and the way that I've kind of come to my comfort, level of comfort with this, is being able to just tell my story and tell my existence, and understand that it doesn't represent everyone who identifies as African American, but it does give some perspective of what African American folks can and oftentimes do go through, and being very clear when I explain that, because I don't want anyone to look at me and my story and make an assumption that that's the way that all African Americans' lives are, which often does happen. And I have 2 master's degrees. I went to grad school twice, and I remember being in the mandatory diversity class and being one of, 2, maybe even 3, and oftentimes the only brown face in the class. And we're talking about groups that I don't even represent, and everybody's looking at me to answer the question. It's like, I don't know. I'm not a part of that cultural group. I don't know. So I'm very mindful of the context of the conversation and the setting before I start speaking about, the experience of a particular types of people, because it may be different. So to me, it's really a subjective answer based on what's actually going on.
No, I'd agree. I think we do kind of put it on people of color to kind of take over that conversation. I know my students will often tell me that when they're learning about the civil rights movement, or they're learning about slavery or whatever, like everyone's head turns and looks at them because they're like one of the 2 Black kids in the class, like you said. Um, and it's not their job to talk about that stuff. It's also, they're not obligated to share their experiences if that's the conversation that's happening in the classroom, right? They don't have to relive their trauma for your gain. Um, and so I think it's about managing that situation if you're the one facilitating that conversation, and like trying not to like look at the Black kid when you're asking about like police brutality and stuff like that, right? Like this conversation's for everybody. It's not really for them if you think about it. So I think for me, I sometimes I would feel obligated, and there were times where I'm like, I don't want to talk about this right now. Like this isn't my thing. And sometimes another student or someone else would speak up, and I'd be like, okay, cool, because right now I'm not really feeling it. But at the same time, for me, I personally want to educate and be a part of this conversation. So I've made it's my job now. And so I clearly do want to talk about it and be that resource for people. And so it's like you said, it's really individual and it really depends. But I would say generally we do kind of rely on people of color to share their experiences for people to learn when there's other ways to do that and not force them into that conversation. So.
I'd have to agree. And please don't ask me where the best taco place is around, because I don't know that. We get that all the time too.
And you should know, right? Because everybody has a different taste bud for tacos. Like, you're not the authority on, authentic, Latino food. What is that?
I tell them my house. I'm like, I don't go out.
And they have to pay top dollar for those if they want them. Can I add one more thing that I think is important for us to add to this dialogue? Because I see this happen a lot, is when we talk about culture or diversity or even equity and inclusion, since we're such a race-focused country, we often default to BIPOC people's culture. So Black people's culture or Indigenous people's culture. And usually those just get thrown in a big box. And even though there's a lot of differences and nuances throughout those cultures. But one thing that we don't talk about is white culture. And white people get very uncomfortable when we say, let's talk about white culture. Because when we talk about Black history and all these stuffs, and people want to look at the Black kid in class, we're really talking about white history, not necessarily Black history. We're talking about some of the nasty things that have been done a lot of the times, but we also have to have this conversation about what is white culture. And I think that that's a big, I see a movement going towards that. But we have to be honest that, it can't just be in these academic spaces and these social service spaces. It have to be in the everyday dialogue, especially now where talking about race and ethnicity has become almost a trend, unfortunately, but it's actually a focus. We have to talk about what is white culture and what does it mean, because white culture becomes very synonymous with a lot of the isms that we have. And if we want to break these things down, we have to have an honest look at it and talk about it.
How can we try to understand opinions that are different than ours or where the other person is coming from?
I think it goes back to asking questions, right? It goes back to trying to find out what that person's lived experience has been. Try to find out what they've been taught, what they've been exposed to, what they, not only in your family history, but also in school. I grew up in Chicago, urban area, predominantly Mexican American, but probably my history book was the same as it was necessarily here in Minnesota, right? So that has something to do with my point of view and those white students who were next to me in that area as well. Also, who were their teachers? Was it teachers who looked like them, who were able or were not able to change that narrative or that teaching? Were they able to connect to teachers who look like them or look different from them? So one of the things that I'm always constantly thinking about is how are those adults around our students making an effect or having an effect on what is being taught to our students, right? So if you're taught by all white people or white teachers who all come from the same school and all have the same lived experiences, and we don't all have the same lived experiences, but that's going to form your frame of reference, right? So I think part of that solution is to really dive deep into where those people are coming from who have those different opinions. And then again, to open up that dialogue. And sometimes those dialogues and those opportunities are not going to be there, right? And sometimes you're just going to have to walk away from that, and you're going to have to be okay with not being able to change that opinion or even wanting to try to attack that opinion and have that conversation with that person. We talked kind of earlier about our self-care, and I think that's an important piece of it, right? So if you approach a person who you are really struggling to understand where they're coming from, then I think there comes a certain point in time where you have to kind of decide, is this going to affect my self-care and my truth and how I feel? And is this something that I need to approach right now, right? So, you can't fix things at a time when somebody who is not willing or able at the moment to move, so if that's going to cost you and how you think about yourself and your self care and your thought process, then I think you have to be self-aware enough to be like, okay, I need to move on from that situation. And I don't know if that answered the question or not, but I hope I did.
Yeah. So then do you guys feel like it's helpful to withhold judgment from what other people are saying, or is it sometimes that some things are just right and wrong? The example that we talked about when we were planning this is, not separate from race issues, but even just masking up with COVID. Are there really two sides to that? And how do you hold people accountable without normalizing opinions that may not be what you agree with?
I think when you are having these conversations or something like that comes up, I always say, like in a group setting, I'll say trust intent, but name impact. And that's kind of in an established, like, safe environment, that a group of people have come together and they're ready to have this conversation. And that's something that I think works a lot. And it allows people to share when something hurts them and not feel like they're having a confrontation with that other person, because that's not necessarily something that people from the Midwest are good at. And so if you give them that space to do that and feel okay with it, it comes off better. And again, it's the same thing like you all were saying, is asking questions and going, oh, well, what did you mean by that? Or can you say it again in a different way? Like, I feel like I misunderstood you, right? It gives space for that person to kind of think about what they just said and why that might have hurt the other person. And give that other person the opportunity to use their voice and say, like, no, I don't agree with that because of this. But then there are things where it's like, no, like we can't entertain that because it's harmful and there's no way to misunderstand that. There is no way for that to mean something else. And you have to find what that is for you, what that line is in conversations, whether that's in a big group, in a planned equity group, or if it's a one-on-one conversation where you go, no, like, no, you're wrong. And here's why, because I can't, in good conscience and to take care of myself, listen to that point of view, because it's not a point of view, it's just destructive. And finding that line, I think, is really important. And a trend right now, I guess I would say, is pretending like that line doesn't exist. And if you establish that line, especially as a marginalized person, you're kind of seen as, oh, well, you're not really inclusive, which is, again, just kind of another way to, I guess, diminish experiences of people of color, especially. So yeah, I think you have to find your line and also understand that sometimes things are just facts and we can't pretend like there is another point of view. And when you do, like you said, it normalizes it and it allows people to kind of run with it instead of shutting it down when it should be shut down.
To add to that, I would also say, when we see and hear things that it's not just an open opinion, but that's kind of blatant, then things do need to be said just as boldly as back to them, and that pushback needs to be said, and that needs to be challenged, right? And I think you kind of have to know what that is. So there's a difference between like a conversation or whatever, but if there's an action that goes with it, or there's a slur, or there's, something that has a dire consequence, then I think it's up to everyone who witnesses that to come out and say that. If it's going to hurt somebody, then we have that responsibility to then go ahead and say something. So, there's one thing about having a conversation, but there's a difference. And just like Olivia said, there is a line, and you have to know what that line is, right? Because that's, one of the things that I always, and it kind of goes back to a couple of different things, right? And I can go into this. So there's two pieces. There's that implicit bias that it's very difficult to fight. And then there's that outright racism, kind of behaviors that's kind of easier to deal with, right? But either way, we need to confront it, and how we confront it depends on the situation and on the person. But I think when it's outright blatant, then we need to stand up and we need to say, no, that's not okay, period. And that's it.
They nailed it. I have nothing to add.
I was going to say one more thing I think of when we're talking about opinions and stuff, and then to me, what I always say is like, and maybe I read this somewhere, I don't really remember, but an opinion is like whether or not you like cream in your coffee, not necessarily if certain people should have rights or not. And understanding that, I think, is kind of the backbone to all these things, right? It's like, that wasn't an opinion, that was just hurtful, like that was just racist, or that was sexist, or that was, and is understanding that and knowing that in that space, whatever space you're in, that's not allowed, and not entertaining things that are not opinions, that are masqueraded as opinions, which we see a lot of today. So
In the chat, someone has asked if you could give examples of how to gracefully bow out of a conversation that has started to cross your boundaries.
I see this question come up often, and I think that people make it a bigger step than it needs to be. And what I usually say is be comfortable enough to just say, right now I don't feel comfortable in this conversation, and I would like to just stop, or I have something to do. Or you can always use a little deception and just say, I gotta go check on something else or do something else to get out of it. But really, no matter what your tactic is to get out of conversation, it really depends on the rapport and the dynamic of the person that you're having the conversation with. So if it's in a workplace setting, right, that becomes a little bit more testy, because now it could be HR related situation. It could be your boss saying something to you, or maybe you are the boss and one of your staff said something to you, or a peer, or maybe it's a participant or client or patient of yours. You have to figure out what's the best way to disengage in that conversation. But typically I'm a firm believer of just letting people know that this is not something that you want to talk about and you're done.
When somebody says something or feels a certain way that's very strongly opposed to the way you feel, does it change the way you feel about that person, and how so?
I think it does. It can. Not always. There's a lot of things that you can strongly disagree upon, but they're kind of in the same. They're like in a certain spectrum, right? Of ideas. So it's a little bit easier to be like, I strongly disagree with this, but it's within this spectrum over here. So we can kind of have conversations about it and have an open dialogue versus something that's like way out of your spectrum. And it does change that relationship, or it makes you question, how can we maintain it or not maintain it? Because like I said, that opinion thing, right? If it's inherently against my rights to exist or to be who I am, then how can you, like, I'm more confused by how you're friends with me if you also think that, right? Like if you are sexist or racist, right? If you have beliefs about something, or if I share something with you and you strongly disagree, I don't know if you actually do value this friendship, because you would listen to me and understand that what you're saying is hurtful and harmful and not actually true and comes from a place of discrimination. So yeah, if it is severe enough, it does make you question it, and it should, and that's not always easy. But I think especially right now, and I'm hearing it a lot from students, they're kind of re-evaluating a lot of the people that they interact with on an everyday basis. They always tell me kids got really bold now that we're all online, and going through their follower list and unfollowing people, and so it's happening a lot right now. But I think it should, because some things, like you said, are just not tolerable.
And I think it goes back to about, does it make you feel safe around that person, right? So if I don't feel safe around that person, then I don't know if my judgment is not going to be biased about that person, because it's just the truth. It's human nature, right? It goes back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where we need to be safe. That's one of our first needs as human beings. And if I can't feel safe around that person because he or she or they have an opinion that is directly about me and who I am, or not even directly about me, even indirectly about me, but I'm part of that opinion that is derogatory, and they question my safety, right? It's about my safety, and if I don't feel safe, then I have to go back to that whole piece of self-care, and I have to really think about. I have to think about me, right? I have to think about, is my well-being worth this judgment? Not to judge them. Um, it just always goes back to safety.
So how do you remove somebody from your life in a way that's respectful, if you will, to the other, and provide self-care while doing it?
I think it rounds back to where we talked about a little bit earlier around defining what our boundaries are and being comfortable enough to let people know what your expectations are in the relationship. And that can be very hard if it's a close friend, it could be a partner, it could be a family member, but again, it has to do with that self-awareness and that level of comfort that you have with yourself to set that boundary. And then you have to determine what type of relationship will you have with this person moving forward, knowing that they can or have caused harm in your life. And sometimes that's a full cutoff. Sometimes it's only connecting around the holiday season. Sometimes it's just only about work if it's a coworker. But you have to determine what the level of that relationship will be moving forward, given where this person is. And that can be very hard. But it takes a lot of self-awareness, self-care, and just self-determination on what you want your life to be.
I think being honest too is super important because, like, that person, I think it's important for that person to know why it's happening, whether they agree with you or not. Just be honest, and you'll feel a lot better about it than like making up an excuse and having to, go around it every time they try to interact with you. And like, what Sandy was saying is state the stakes, right? Like, I don't feel safe around you or the people you interact with because I know that you agree with this. And that's how big of a deal it is for me. And whether that maybe leads to you reconnecting and then kind of be like, oh wow, I don't want to lose this person, let me figure this out, or again it leads to you cutting this person out. As long as you just have to be honest and state the stakes. I think people tend to say like, oh, you cut people out just because they don't agree with your politics or they don't agree with this, and it's like, yeah, I did, because again, I don't feel safe, and the things you agree with hurt me and my community, and I shouldn't have to tolerate that. So I think that's the biggest part, is be honest and let that person know why it's happening. If you can too, because again, the safety thing, if it is that unsafe, then maybe not, But for the most part, in situations like this, especially with family and other stuff, I think being honest is super important.
And how do you deal with your own feelings when these conversations or relationships don't go well? What can happen personally when feelings aren't addressed? And how do you approach that going forward?
Well, if you're neurotic like me, you would like play that conversation over and over and over again in your head, in the shower, while you sleep, all of those things. But I think basically though, it's a reflection, right? Like, you're reflecting back on that conversation. And then I think what I do is I try to kind of pick it apart necessarily, and like pull my reasonings for what I said and where I stand. And also try to understand, okay, was there something that I wasn't listening to or didn't hear from that perspective? But at the same time, again, it's always going back to those courageous conversation pillars, about being uncomfortable, right? And speaking your truth, and knowing that things aren't going to always be resolved, right? So eventually you have to get over it, right? And either that action is going to be, you're going to go back and have another conversation, or you're going to drop it. So, I mean, there can be an action, and whatever that action is, you have to be okay with it. But I think you have to kind of, again, go to that self-reflection piece and decide what you're okay with. But basically it goes back to that self-care. How are you going to feel in the end? And how are you going to be okay with it?
And then for our last question, does your self-care include others? And how can we expand these relationships to include others in our self-care?
I would say that it does. I think that, and I threw this term out earlier about being sustainable. I think one of the things that we need in our sustainability plans, which is just our self-care, being proactive, is social support. And you should have friends that can support you, if it's something tough that you're dealing with at work or at home. But you should have people that you can connect with, or pets. Right, we should have other beings that we can connect with that help us just kind of get our minds right around what's going on. And so also, so we don't feel like we're alone in this kind of journey that we're taking. It's very, very important to be connected, and those connections can look very different. It could be virtual, it could be someone that you know or someone that you don't know. It could be a therapist. It could be a lot of different things, but you should find other social supports to the best of your ability.
I completely agree with that. I think finding community is huge in this too. And I'm an introvert, so I need that time alone for sure. But a lot of times it is seeking people out. And I know for me, when I was on campus at UW-Madison, having that scholarship, mostly of other students of color, marginalized students, got me through that. It was rough at first for me. And having that group of people, even if I wasn't super close with anybody yet, we still met monthly, and then our smaller group met, and just knowing that those people existed and we had similar experiences slowly turned into a group of people that were really close. And you walked into that room and you could just take a breath. And that is huge. Even if you're not talking about what's going on, you're just around people who understand. And we always used to say community is super important on a campus like this. And eventually, like it turned into a bit of a joke, almost like something would happen and we'd be like, well, community is very important on a campus like this. And being able to joke about serious things, I think, is also a way to handle a lot of the trauma that's happening. I think communities of color tend to do that. And that's also important too, like people that you can just have fun with and not necessarily talk about what's going on. And if you do, maybe it's in a lighthearted way. So yeah, bringing in people, and hopefully that expands, right? And it starts to include people in your workplace too. So workplaces are also safe spaces, and being at school is a safe space. But do what you can, and even if it's a small group, if it's one other person, you have to not feel alone, and that's really hard to do right now for sure. But coming from an introvert, you can't feel alone.
If I can just add to that, I think it's also important that you find people around you who empower you, who validate and affirm you, and who but also have the strength and closest to you to give you some constructive criticism, right? And be like, hey, did you think about it this way, or did you think about it that way? But having those people around that make sure that they're always they have you in mind first, right? And they're validating and affirming your so that you feel empowered, because what it really is that we need to empower each other and other people. So, but when you feel empowered, you can do that for other people. And that's that that pay it forward effect just in itself, right? So just thinking about who's around you and making sure that they are validating your existence.
Well, our time is up. And I think, Sandy, like you said, we need to be okay with the non-closure of this discussion because it's work that's important and needs to continue these conversations. We want to thank all three of you, Sandy, Olivia, and Brandon, so much for being part of this last conversation with us. And thank you to all of you who've been part of this conversation at home. Thank you for watching and for your questions and your comments. The recording of tonight's event will be, and all three of the events, actually, please go back and watch the other two. They were great. They will be on the YSB and St. Croix Family Resource Center websites. Please feel free to share it. And I feel like we need to have a second session, especially Brandon, with the white culture. That is a fascinating topic that maybe we need to plan something on that. But again, thank you all. Thanks for joining us. Keep up the good work and take care.